Hello, I'm Lynn Sparrow, and welcome to this presentation on Using Karma, Choosing Grace. This session has been designed to give you a working understanding of these laws of karma and grace, to understand how they're already operating in your life, and how you can open up to and work cooperatively with these laws more. Now, most of us who embrace the concept of reincarnation find that it does some profound things to our understanding. We have a different understanding of life and death. We have a new appreciation of the connection between the choices we make and the things that happen to us. Or looking at it from the other end, we can take the things that are happening to us and understand that they're connected to choices that we've made. We also tend to have a deepened understanding of the nature of God and our relationship to God. And usually as we work with reincarnation, the law that we think about most is the law of karma. And that's understandable, because the law of karma is what allows us to use the process of incarnation to grow and to understand through knowing what the consequences of our choices are. We learn through the law of karma that if we make a certain kind of choice that is constructive and positive, in line with love and harmony, sooner or later there will be pleasant results. We also learn through the law of karma that when we make choices that are negative, when we make choices that are out of harmony with the great harmony of the universe, when we set things in motion that are not in keeping with the greatest good, sooner or later we will experience unpleasant consequences. And so we learn, so we grow. We also know that through the law of cause and effect, we come into our full capacity as co-creators with God. We understand that our choices have meaning, that our choices bring about creations in this material world. And so we grow up into our destiny, which Edgar Cayce said was to be companions and co-creators with God. But the law of karma by itself at times can be seen as a process of trial and error, cause and effect. We try it one way and it works. We try it another way and it doesn't work. And so we have to go back and do it again. This can be a long and arduous task, and sometimes people say, how long will it take? I mean, the law of karma just seems to at times be an arduous route. Well, fortunately, according to the material in the Edgar Cayce readings, the law of karma is not the only law that is governing our growth and is there to transform us and to help us in our path of spiritual development. Edgar Cayce spoke at great length about the law of grace, gave it equal importance to the law of karma, and suggested that it was very important that we not lose sight of the tremendous power of this transformative law called grace. Let's take a look at an Edgar Cayce reading about grace. He said, "To be sure, law applies, for in the beginning of man, in his becoming a living soul in the earth, laws were established, and these take hold. But lose not sight of the law of grace, the law of mercy, the law of patience as well. For each has its place, especially when individual entities consider and seek, desire, that they may be channels through which life, God, may manifest." And so we are going to be taking a very careful look today at the law of grace, seeing it alongside the law of karma and understanding the interrelationship between these two great transformative laws. We'll see karma and grace as two spiritual, universal, equally important laws. And now at times it may seem as though karma and grace are alternatives facing us, that we choose to operate under karma, or as an alternate, we choose to operate under grace. But ultimately we'll see that that's not in fact the case, that the law of karma is always there, and that the law of grace is always there, and that our experience with karma and grace is like the experience of two sides of the same coin. They are ultimately two expressions of the same reality, and together they can transform us. We'll further explore how, in order to understand one fully, we really need to understand the other. We cannot fully appreciate karma without understanding grace. And conversely, we can't fully appreciate grace unless we have a deep appreciation for the law of karma as well. And so we'll see that our path in soul development is ultimately one of using karma in constructive ways and choosing to open up to grace moment by moment as a transformer of our consciousness. So let's begin by taking a closer look at the law of karma. Now, contrary to popular misconception, karma is not fate, karma is not destiny. Karma is not a system of punishments and rewards. That's probably the most important thing we could know about karma. Because in fact, karma is a universal law in the spiritual world, much the same way that gravity, for example, is a law in the physical world. And let's just look at that analogy and see what it has to teach us about the way karma works. If I were to go to the roof of my house and walk off the edge, I would not say when I landed on the ground that it had been my fate or my destiny to have that crash landing. I certainly wouldn't say that gravity was punishing me for doing something wrong. I would understand that I had acted in a certain way that made it necessary for gravity being what it was to cause a certain result. This is really very much like the way the law of karma works in our lives. If we look at gravity and we see that there's a directional flow to it, that is, while we're here on the Earth, the directional flow is toward the Earth. Gravity is a force that pulls all things down toward the Earth. That force is a constant. It doesn't change based on what we do. It doesn't change based on our choices. Our experience of it changes based on our choices, though. Chances are, for example, as you have been sitting here, listening now, you haven't been especially aware of gravity. It's been there, but you have been acting in such a way as to not become aware of its force. Now, if you were to try to leap up and touch your ceiling, I'll bet you'd become very aware of gravity very quickly. And if you were to try the little experiment I talked about a moment ago and walk off some high surface, you would become even more aware of gravity. Nothing about gravity has changed. What has changed is the action you have taken in relationship, in interaction with that force that is pulling things toward the Earth. Now, if we can extend our analogy a little bit, imagine that the spiritual environment that we as souls exist in, the reality that is the base in which we have our existence, also has a directional flow. It's a flow toward goodness. It's a flow toward perfection, toward harmony, toward wholeness. Let's take, for example, the analogy of a stream. And we can almost see that the flow that we as spiritual beings exist in is a flow toward all that is good and positive. Now, when we hold in our consciousness thoughts that are in line with that goodness, with that love, with that harmony, peace, and all of those positive things we could imagine, it's as if we are going with the flow. Now, what happens when we go with the flow? Our momentum, the energy that we put into our thoughts, the energy that we put into the things that we say, the energy that we put into the things that we do toward and for other people, is added to the great momentum of the stream that we are in. And it's sort of like when you're at the airport and you get on a moving sidewalk and you walk while the sidewalk carries you along. Your momentum, added to the great momentum of that stream that you as a soul exist in, carries you forward at an accelerated rate. Any goodness that you put forth is multiplied, accelerated. Any peace that you create is multiplied, accelerated. Any love that you feel, express, and speak is multiplied, accelerated. And so what happens? We experience what we would call good karma. Good results come because we're going in the flow. We are going with that great directionality. We are moving in cooperation with that great force that we as spiritual beings exist within. Now, there's another thing we do sometimes, and that is to attempt to go against the flow. We think things that are out of harmony with peace and love, wholeness and perfection. We speak to one another in ways that are out of harmony with those things. We act toward one another in ways that are out of harmony with those things. We hold within our consciousness patterns that are not in keeping with that flow. And that's sort of like going against the flow of the stream. Now, if you have ever tried to swim against a current, you know that you begin to feel an opposing force. Now, sooner or later, that stream toward goodness, toward love, toward perfection, will assert itself and spin us around and get us going back in the right direction. And when it does, that course correction may feel unpleasant. We may get dunked under and come up sputtering with water up our noses saying, that was a heavy load of bad karma I just faced. But in truth, what we can see is that it in fact has been nothing more than that great directional flow of goodness that is our spiritual base, asserting its directionality and getting us back on course. Now, the amount of energy, persistence, stubbornness, if you will, that we put into flowing against the stream will have much to do with the power, the force that it will take to turn us around. If we, for a very brief time, and without a lot of energy behind it, flow against the stream, we can be turned around relatively easily. And we have gentle course corrections. And many of us experience these within the span of one lifetime. It doesn't necessarily have to be spread over a long period from lifetime to lifetime. But when we persist, when we build with our emotions and with our intentions and with our sheer force of will, negative momentum, and we keep swimming against the stream, that force of resistance gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the course correction is going to be that much more traumatic when that stream sends us back in the right direction. But the important thing to realize here, probably the most important thing that we can keep in mind as we consider the corrective nature of karma, is that the karma has been a completely impersonal spiritual law of cause and effect that has done nothing more than put us back in that flow, put us back in the direction toward the love and the perfection and the harmony and all of those positive qualities that we could think of. Now, the main thing to keep in mind here is that the cause and effect action of karma is a cause and effect reaction between that which we are doing, that which we are thinking and saying, in other words, the quality of our consciousness, an interaction between what we put out and the nature of the spiritual realm that we exist in, the matrix, if you will, of our existence as spiritual beings. Karma, then, is not a system of punishments and rewards. It's not even a destiny or a fate. And it's certainly not a cosmic ledger where every misdeed we've ever done has been duly recorded, and sooner or later, one day or another, we're going to have to pay the price. This notion that karma is something that must catch up with us someday is perhaps one of the things that can trip us up the most in our capacity to understand and open up to the transformative power of karma and the transformative power of grace. Here's what Edgar Cayce had to say about notions of karmic debt. What is karmic debt? This ye have made a bugaboo. This ye have overbalanced within thyself. What is thy life? But the gift of thy Maker, that ye may be wholly one with him. Now, this concept that the whole purpose of life is for us to become one with our Creator, to become one with our source, to be in a relationship of harmony, unity, and oneness with our source is the key to our understanding of karma. And as you'll see in a little while, it's also the key to our understanding of grace. Karma is totally dependent on what we hold in our consciousness in relationship toward that flow toward oneness and harmony and wholeness and connection with our source. Here's another way to look at it. When we think about karma as being a destiny or being a fate, something that must happen to us because of something we've done or something that has happened to us previously, we tend to think of a model that might look something like this. The experiences of life A cause the experiences of life B. So if you have had a certain set of experiences or you have done certain things, there are certain things that must happen to you later on. But there's a problem with this model. It doesn't account for the different directions that the cause and effect outcomes might take. For example, let's say that in one life we have a person who consistently and persistently lies and cheats and steals. Now, we may see that soul in a subsequent life still lying, still cheating, still stealing, doing all of the same things. Cause and effect. The momentum of the one set of choices in the earlier life has somehow continued, been carried over, and is still being expressed now. On the other hand, we could see exactly the opposite happening with this individual. We could see this person who in an earlier life lies and cheats and steals, now in a lifetime where he or she is being cheated, stolen from, and lied to, experiencing the consequences of those deeds in the past. This too is the law of cause and effect. What was done in the one lifetime is now being faced and met and experienced in the next life. There's a third possibility. We could see that person who lied and cheated and stealed in an earlier life, now in this lifetime as someone who is very honest, who's very generous, who's very giving, who cares for people. This too is the working of the law of cause and effect. A lesson has been learned somewhere along the line, and we find that the law of cause and effect now allows that person who has in the past done these misdeeds to be someone who does just the opposite in the present life. How do we account for this if we go with that simple model where the experiences of one life predestine or fate us or necessitate us to have certain experiences in a subsequent life? I think in order to account for the different paths that the cause and effect chain may take, we need to expand our understanding. I think we need to look at a different model. For example, what if we realize that it is not just the experiences that we have that create our so-called karma, but the concept we have been looking at, it's the consciousness that arises from those experiences. As we see in this model, the experiences of life A, let's take those experiences of lying, cheating, and stealing to follow the analogy we're looking at, give rise to a certain quality of consciousness. That consciousness is what is carried over into a subsequent life. And it is that consciousness then that gives rise to the kind of experiences that one has in the subsequent life experience. So let's imagine that our hypothetical person who has been lying, cheating, and stealing really gets a sense of power out of that, is continuing to swim against the stream, so to speak, is putting more energy, is putting more momentum, is putting more power into that negative mode of behavior. That leaves an imprint in the consciousness, an imprint that is what will be carried over. Because after all, when we talk about carrying over karma, having karma, what pocket do we keep it in? The only one I know of is the consciousness, the memory. And so for our understanding here, it's important to keep in mind that karma is that which you hold in your deepest soul memory. So if we take a person who holds in the deep memory a sense of power, a sense of gratification, a sense of somehow getting away with something through lying and cheating and stealing, that residue in consciousness, that imprint on the consciousness, if you will, it's carried over. And so what do we see in the subsequent life? Someone who seems to have a nature to lie, cheat, and steal, and is still doing that. Now let's imagine another situation. Let's imagine that that person who in the earlier life is lying and cheating and stealing, who has some sense of conscience that comes in, and there is a realization that this was a very bad thing to do. In fact, there is more than a realization. There is a sense of overwhelming guilt, a sense within the individual consciousness that says, this was a terrible thing to do. Sooner or later, this will catch up with me. Sooner or later, I will have to pay the price. Sooner or later, I will face karma for this. Now remember, these are not necessarily only the realizations held on the level of the conscious mind. These are subconscious awarenesses as well. And so what the residue is in the consciousness is often a product of how a current experience commingles with what we have in the subconscious mind from prior experiences as well. Now, if the residue in consciousness is one of great guilt, of culpability, of deserving to be punished, and so on, that, when carried over into another life, may in fact attract those corrective experiences, those experiences of having the shoe on the other foot, so to speak, of being the one who is stolen from, of being the one who is cheated, of being the one who is unfairly treated. And on the level of the subconscious and on the level of the soul mind, there is the learning of the lesson. This would be like the course correction that comes when the stream, remember the oppositional force comes to a crisis point, so to speak, where there must be the turnaround. And so we find a person reaping what we might call bad karma, that is, experiencing the corrective measures that teach that consciousness that it's not okay to do those things to other people. Now, if we follow our diagram to the next step, we find that it's possible for something else to happen. It's possible for an individual, after once having committed acts that are not in keeping with the highest ideals and purposes, let's say, following our analogy here, having lied, cheated, stolen, whatever, there is a consciousness of recognizing that that is not in keeping with the highest. There is a consciousness of being transformed and healed, a consciousness that says, I no longer choose to be that kind of person. I no longer choose to do those things. An individual who instead chooses to act in a positive way. That residue in consciousness carried over to a subsequent life is likely to manifest itself as someone who is being very honest, being very generous, serving and helping other people. There are many examples in the Edgar Cayce readings of people who were meeting their karma, not by facing retribution, but by making restitution. There's a world of difference. But the law of cause and effect is operational in all of those cases. That which the individual is holding in consciousness is in interaction with that flow toward harmony, that flow toward love, that flow toward peace and perfection. And so we find that as we understand the central importance of what we hold in conscious residue, what we allow to be there in our deepest soul memory as a result of our experiences, as a result of what we've done, not only does that consciousness have profound impact on the nature of cause and effect, our understanding that consciousness is the determinant of karma opens the door for us to understand grace and in its impact on our life. So let's take a closer look at the law of grace and see how it interacts with the law of karma. Now, just as karma is a universal spiritual law, so too grace is a universal spiritual law. Karma is a universal spiritual law that flows from one set of attributes of the Creator. It's an attribute of the Creator that brings harmony and order to the universe. It is the nature of the underlying spiritual reality that is God. Just as karma is a universal spiritual law, so too grace is a universal spiritual law. As we saw, karma is actually an expression of one of the major attributes of God. That is, God as a force that has a directionality toward perfection, toward love, toward peace, toward harmony. Grace is an expression of God as a person. Not a person with arms and legs and a body, but a person in the sense that God has a direct and personal caring relationship with each one of us. That God's love is a prevailing and personal force in this universe. When we look at karma and grace as two sides to the attributes of God, we begin to get a sense, once again, of how they are two sides to the same coin. Now, the Edgar Cayce readings address this idea of God being both a force in an impersonal sense and God being very personal. One person began a question of Edgar Cayce by asking, if God is impersonal force or energy, and Edgar Cayce interrupted by saying, he is impersonal, but as has been just given, so very personal. It is not that ye deal only with impersonal. It is within and without. It is in and without. And so, as we have been tracing this two-sided coin that we call karma and grace, we can begin to see how karma and grace are flowing from the basic nature of the God who has brought us into being. When we look at the law of karma as a force that has a certain impersonal direction to it that make sure that the universe moves in a direction of positive love, harmony, wholeness, and perfection, we see the law of karma. When we think about the attribute of God that holds us in a loving relationship, the attribute of God that cares for us personally, we begin to see the reflection of the law of grace. And as we'll see, grace does not suspend or cancel out karma, but instead it interacts with it perfectly in such a way as to transform our consciousness. And as we've already seen, when our consciousness is transformed, so too is our experience of karma transformed. Let's go back to that earlier analogy to gravity. Now, we saw how the law of gravity, in a very direct and impersonal way, would determine that if I walked off the roof of my home, I would crash to the ground. But we know that when we get in an airplane and take a trip somewhere, there is another set of laws in operation that somehow enable us to fly despite the law of gravity. The laws of aerodynamics interact with gravity in such a way that the airplane stays aloft. I think this is a pretty good analogy for the way the law of grace operates, because the law of grace allows us to interact in a different way with the law of cause and effect. And just as that plane can soar above the earth, with the law of grace operational in our consciousness, we can soar above what can at times be the effects of the law of karma or cause and effect, to pull us down into very arduous experience. Here's a way that Edgar Cayce spoke about that idea. He said, "And the mind of an entity is the builder. Then, as the entity sets itself to do or accomplish that which is of a creative influence or force, it comes under the interpretation of the law between karma and grace. No longer is the entity then under the law of cause and effect, or karma, but rather in grace it may go on to the higher calling as set in him." And so we can see that grace is something that allows us not to be pulled down into the sheer trial and error aspect of the law of cause and effect, but it instead takes us to a higher interaction with it, just as that airplane can take us up above the ground, even though gravity is in operation. Now, there's a great paradox, I believe, in our understanding of grace, and it's one of the things that will at times make it difficult for us to fully grasp what grace is all about and to be able to allow the operation of grace in our lives. The first thing we need to understand about grace is that there's nothing we can do to earn it. It's a gift that has already been freely given, and as such, it flows from the nature of our Creator, rather than in response to whether we're good or not. Grace is because God is good, and grace is all around us. It's unearned. There's nothing we can do to make it happen. On the other hand, it's not forced upon us. It's a gift that's handed, but we are the ones who must accept it and open up to it. It's an expression of the love of God in the sense that it reminds us that the Creator's agenda is reconciliation and harmony with us, rather than criminal justice. That is, no matter what we may have done, in this lifetime or other times, the point of our growing as souls, the point of our learning, is not that we face retribution for each thing we've done, but rather, do we allow our consciousness to be transformed to rise above that, to become a different kind of person, to be brought into that harmony and that reconciliation with our source. Now, for many people, this is a much tougher idea to grasp than karma is. There's a certain crisp logic to karma. It may not always be pleasant, but at least the logical mind can grasp it. We can understand it, and we can feel at least that the world makes sense. So sometimes, maybe you have had the experience, even as you are experiencing the corrective action of karma, there is something within you that almost delights in it and says, hey, this stuff really works. There is a law of cause and effect. I can predict how life will go. And there is something comfortable about that to most human beings. Grace, on the other hand, is the wild card. Grace is the law that suggests that change, that transformation, that a totally new picture is as near as a change in consciousness. that at any given moment, if we choose to open up to the power of love that is grace, if we choose to come into that relationship of love and allow it to do its work on our consciousness, then all of our experience will be changed accordingly. And so, as we grapple with an understanding of grace, and as we deal with this paradox of it being something that is always there and yet only there for us as we open up to it, we come to the question of getting a deeper understanding of how it is that we can learn to open up to grace. How can we experience it in our lives? Because usually once we have experienced something, we have a much more profound understanding of it than we had when we are simply working with words and concepts. So let's see if we can clarify the way grace operates in human life, and in so doing get a better understanding of how we can open up to it more and more. Now, I've found many times that even with difficult spiritual and metaphysical concepts, it's a good thing to start with a basic dictionary definition to get a sense of a starting place. And I found that when I turned to the dictionary, there were some very interesting definitions of grace. Now, of course, the dictionary had definitions that were not related to spiritual concepts, grace in the sense of being a graceful dancer and things like that. But the theological definition of grace has 4 parts to it. And I think that these parts have great bearing on the concepts that we're looking at here. The first thing we see is that grace is defined as the free, unmerited love and favor of God. Well, that's the concept that we have just been looking at. We also see further that the dictionary says that grace is divine influence acting in man to restrain him from sin. Now, we might want to change the language a little bit to fit with the concepts we've been looking at here. In fact, we can even go back to the stream analogy. We might say that this part of the definition is divine influence acting in us to keep us from going against the flow of the stream when we are inclined to turn around and create that oppositional force. It is that which intervenes before we do something that would create negative residue in the consciousness. The next portion of the dictionary definition of grace says it's a state of reconciliation with God. Well, this sounds a lot like the concept that we have been looking at. That is, that as our consciousness is brought into harmony with God, as our consciousness is brought into alignment with those positive attributes of peace and goodness and all of those things that we looked at in connection with the stream, we are brought into oneness, reconciliation with our source. And then the final definition, given in the theological portion in Webster, is spiritual instruction, improvement, and edification. Now, this is an action of grace where even the things that seem to be difficult, even the things that seem to be troubling and painful and arduous, are transformed into tremendous spiritual lessons. This is probably the one we can understand best when we look back to when we first embraced reincarnation. Because usually what we experience when we first seriously consider the possibility of reincarnation and first seriously consider the working of karma in our lives, things that at the time that we have experienced them have been painful or have seemed unfair or have in one way or another been very, very difficult, we will suddenly realize have been part of our soul growth. That is a little piece of grace, that turning an experience into something that transforms our understanding. So from this definition in the dictionary, we can see that not only is grace free and unearned, but there are 3 places in the cause and effect chain of experience where grace can intervene. Grace can intervene before we do something that would ultimately require the corrective action of karma. In that sense, grace is like that still small voice within that does give us a warning, a moment before we do something that later on will need to be corrected in some way. There is usually that moment before we say an unkind word, or that moment before we do something that is not in keeping with our highest ideals and purposes, that moment before we take some action that is not in keeping with the best. There is a little tug within, and we can begin to recognize that as grace sort of knocking on the door saying, I'm here. Just pause a moment and You will not have to do this thing that will ultimately create a detour for you. So one place of intervention for grace is before we have done something that will have consequences down the road for us to have to clean up one way or another. Grace can also intervene after we have done something that would require corrective karma, but before the corrective action occurs. That is, we have already said something that we maybe should not have said about another person, or done something that is not in keeping with our highest ideals and purposes. Now, do we suddenly have something on our cosmic ledger? There's going to be karma for this sooner or later. You're going to be punished for it no matter what. Or do we have an opportunity to allow the transformative power of grace to heal that negative pattern, to transform us? And once the consciousness is transformed, there's no more lesson to be learned about that. And remember, the Creator is interested in us learning and being reconciled and growing into the fullness of a relationship rather than that we have certain corrective experiences. We can see that the third place where grace can intervene, and this relates to the last of the dictionary definitions about spiritual instruction and edification, is after we've already begun to experience corrective karma. Yes, we have done something of an undesirable nature in the past. Yes, we are now experiencing some corrective karma about it. Now, we can experience that in a way that is very painful and that is a very unpleasant thing, or we can allow the law of grace to transform our consciousness so that we experience it as the great spiritual blessing that it is. Now, interestingly, we find these same three interventions of grace pointed out in the Edgar Cayce material. We see grace as an influence that directs us on the level of intentions, ideals and purposes, the level of intentions before we do those things that could lead to corrective karma down the road. Let's take a look at one excerpt that points to this possibility. For this is the evolution of the earth, the evolution of things, the evolution of ideas and of ideals. For he came into the earth that through him man might have access again to the grace and mercy of those spiritual forces that are the directing ideals of each soul entity. Now notice there are two aspects to this. There is the aspect of relationship. Through him we may have access as we connect to our God, as we connect to our source, as we relate in a personal relationship of love with that source. We have access to the grace and mercy of those spiritual forces that are the directing ideals of the soul entity. So I think that this is one indication of that power of grace to intervene before we do something that would down the road require some form of correction. Let's look at this in terms of the cause and effect diagram that we have used previously, where we have life A and life B, and we have the consciousness that arises from the experiences in each life. What we're suggesting here, when we talk about an intervention of grace before we do something that will need to be taken care of and corrected later on, is that before we commit that act, before we say those words, before we think those things, there is an intervention that allows us to have a different quality of consciousness. And as a result, we do something different. And we have a different consciousness that arises from having made that choice. And we are building positive momentum. If we can go back to the analogy of the stream, we are given a little push in the right direction to go with that flow. And our own effort becomes that much easier. The great momentum of the stream is carrying us forward. Now, we can learn to open up to grace in this way by being much more aware of those times when we are just about to do something that deep down inside we know is not in keeping with our highest ideals and purposes. Deep down inside we know that this is not going in that direction of harmony and goodness and love. At that moment before we do it, think about some time recently possibly when you have made that kind of a choice. You are making a choice in that moment to either heed the little voice that says, it's better not to do this, go a different way, or instead to, in the emotion of the moment, in the stubbornness of the moment, whatever it may be, we kind of push forward and do the negative thing anyway. Now, you also will know, if you look back on your experience, that those times when you listen to that little voice, and it had seemed maybe that it would be so hard to refrain from doing this negative thing you wanted to do or this negative thing you wanted to say, the minute you listened to that voice, what happened? There was a great flood of strength. It wasn't as hard once you made that initial pause and allowed that change to happen. That is the inflowing of grace. That you don't have to do it all on your own strength. That there is that gentle knocking on the door that says, if you open the door right now and let that guiding influence flow in, you will find it far easier to do the thing that's in keeping with your ideals and purposes. Now, remember, grace isn't forced on any one of us. We have to accept it. And so when we consider an intervention of grace on this level, we are being given the opportunity to just open the door and let that other influence flow in. And we will find, and you have found at times when you've done this in your life, that it becomes far easier to do the thing that before you made the choice you thought was going to be very difficult to do. Why? Because there is another power that is flowing in. The power of grace that's making it easier for you to do the thing that's in keeping with your growth, with your positive development as a spiritual being. And the next time it will be even easier to listen about that issue anyway. You might have to start from ground one with one of the other areas that you're working on changing and improving. But the important thing is that once we make the initial choice, the power of grace, the action of grace, is that we do not have to do it only on our own power. There is a force that flows in and makes it easier. Now let's look at what happens at those times when we barge ahead anyway, when we ignore that voice, when we say, I'm too mad right now to do it the good way. I'll deal with the karma later on. Or I am just too set on having whatever emotional gratification comes from doing this thing that ultimately is out of harmony with my ideals and purposes. And so we do it anyway. What happens then? Well, the intervention of grace suggests that even then we are not destined or fated to unpleasant karma down the road. Let's take a look at one reading that talked about this power of grace to intervene even after we have set some things in motion and we have given them some power. We are building momentum. In other words, we have started to flow against the stream. Remembering that under the law of grace, this may not be other than an urge, and that making the will of self one with the way may prevent, may overcome, may take the choice that makes for life, love, joy, and happiness, rather than the law that makes, causes the meeting of everything the hard way. So what we find is that we are faced with a choice, even once we have created negative residue in our consciousness, between meeting it the hard way or making the choice that makes for life, love, joy, and happiness. Now, I think this relates to the concept I mentioned a little bit earlier about meeting our karma through making restitution rather than meeting our karma through facing retribution. That once we realize that we have made a mistake, that we have done something or said something, put something in motion that is out of harmony with that great flow, we can either sit back and wait for the stream to push us back in the right direction, that is, experience corrective karma, or we can allow the corrective force on our consciousness, called grace, to flow in and change us. And so here is where we find, in the earlier analogy, the person who once stole from people or cheated people is now someone who is very generous, is helping people. And we have, in the Edgar Cayce readings, many, many examples of people who are now serving the very people or groups or types of people they had once hurt or oppressed in some way. Meeting karma, not the hard way, but instead meeting karma through making restitution. And we might find, if we look back over the history of our soul experience, that even here, even today, some of the things you do that bring you the greatest pleasure and satisfaction in life, perhaps a meaningful life's work, is a meeting of karma. Maybe in the past you were not quite so caring about the people you are now serving in your life's work, and you are, in a very positive way, making the choice that makes for life, love, joy, and happiness, rather than meeting everything the hard way. And so we can even look at the experiences in this life where we're helping other people and we're serving other people and we're doing things to make a positive change in the world as very likely having some positive impact on what would have been our karmic path, as evidence that the law of grace has intervened. Now let's take a look at how this plays out with our cause and effect diagram. What we have here is a situation where in the initial life, the choices are made that would be negative in nature, that would have us going against the flow of the stream, so to speak. Now, there are any number of places where there can be an intervention in consciousness that changes the type of cause and effect experience that will flow from that. It can happen as soon as we have done whatever we may have done that is not in keeping with our highest ideals and purposes. It can happen at any time up until we die in the life where we committed whatever that misdeed might be. It could even happen through a realization between lives. In short, any time before the boom is lowered, so to speak, right up until that moment, there is the power of grace just waiting to transform our consciousness so that we no longer need the lesson. Remember, the boom only gets lowered if that's the only way that we will allow ourselves to learn the lesson. And so, right up until the corrective karma manifests, this is an opportunity for alteration of our consciousness, transformation of our consciousness. So I think for many reincarnationists, along with all of the great comfort about the continuity of life and the fairness of God and the purposefulness of all that we do, there is that nagging fear that says, something I did in 1965 is going to catch up with me someday. Or it may be 3 lifetimes from now, and I'm one step short of being an enlightened person, and something I did 4 lifetimes ago is going to come up on the docket, and I'll have to face it. We tend to, at times when we think fatalistically about karma, to assume that there are lurking there in our soul history the big bad things that are going to rear their ugly heads sooner or later because karma must be paid. Yes, karma must be paid, but remember, the concept we've been exploring and the reading that we have been looking at says that we have a choice between whether we meet that in a way that makes for life, love, joy, and happiness, or in a way that insists on meeting everything the hard way. And so we have the opportunity to allow our consciousness to be transformed. Now, I think in looking at this particular action of grace, it's important here to know that we are not talking about kind of a sense of very superficial turnaround. Oh, I'm sorry, like a child will say, just to avoid punishment. But we're talking here about a soul-level change in consciousness. There's nobody who gets fooled here. We don't fool our deeper selves by pretending we've learned our lessons if we haven't. We certainly don't fool God. What we hold in our deepest consciousness is the part which, if it's transformed, will no longer require the corrective action of the karma. And if it's truly transformed, it will manifest itself through changed behavior, through changed attitudes, through changed words. And so, of course, we can usually know whether the transformation has happened based on whether we're living and acting and thinking like transformed people. As long as we hold on to the negative residue, it has the power to draw to us the corrective experiences. One way or another, we will let go of the negative experience from the past. The choice is ours. Do we allow grace to come in and transform our consciousness, or do we allow ourselves to continue going in a negative direction or expecting corrective karma until it comes along and does its job? Now, that transformation in consciousness can take a number of forms. I think this is one of the reasons that Edgar Cayce so advocated a regular practice of prayer and meditation. Because every time we attune ourselves in relationship to God, and that is Edgar Cayce's definition of meditation, by the way, it's an attuning of ourselves to our spiritual source. Every time we do that, we are, in effect, erasing some of the negative residue there in consciousness. Through that connection in prayer and meditation, we begin to open up the door and allow that free flow that transforms us. We also know that through our attempts to do the right thing, we open up to the law of grace. The reading we've been looking at says, making the will of self one with the way. And of course, in the overall philosophy of the Cayce readings, the way is the way exemplified by Jesus in his creating that pattern of perfect behavior as a spiritual being in a physical body. And so we open up to that transformative power of grace both through what we do in terms of our actions and our treatment of people, and through our inner relationship of attunement with our source. Now, there is that third place where grace can intervene, and let's take a look at a Cayce reading that talks about that. Here was a situation, the person's condition was physical. This was taken from a health reading. And the person was told that the physical condition did have a karmic origin. Remembering the sources, as we have indicated, are the meeting of one's own self, thus are karmic. These can be met most in him who, taking away the law of cause and effect by fulfilling the law, establishes the law of grace. Thus, the needs for the entity to lean upon the arm of him, who is the law and the truth and the light. Now notice, this is a situation where whatever may have been the circumstances of the past, the karmic corrective effect is being experienced through the physical illness. But this individual is reminded of the power of grace to intervene even here, that this experience can be met most how? In relationship. Again, this soul is reminded to connect with God, and to have that sense of being supported and carried through, and thereby establishing the law of grace. Leaning on the arm of him is the way this reading very beautifully puts it. A beautiful picture of that personal quality of our connection to our God. And so as we lean on the arm of that one who loves us in that way, we allow our experience to be transformed. And so an experience that might have been one of just turmoil, suffering, perhaps a sense of it not even making sense, a sense of unfairness, because remember, very often when we are meeting the karmic consequences of the things we've done, the memory of the cause in the past is deep within the unconscious, and we don't even know what's happening. And so as we take our experiences and we let them be sources of spiritual edification, as we let them be sources of strengthening us on a spiritual level, here again is one of the places where we can open up to an intervention of grace. Let's follow this one through into the diagram that we have been looking at related to cause and effect. We have the whole cause and effect chain running all the way through and playing out so that in life B, the karmic corrective action is taking place. But where there's an intervention of grace here, we see that change. We see that it becomes a different quality of experience. And as we understand why we are experiencing some of the difficult things in life, they become more bearable. That concept that as we have a sense of meaning in life, even for the things we suffer, they become much more bearable. Intervention of grace on all of these levels. And so we see grace as an influence that brings a reconciliation and change in consciousness at an accelerated rate, even once we have begun to experience some of the corrective action of karma. In all of these examples, you can see how the law of cause and effect operates perfectly, uninterruptedly. All that changes, all that varies, is the quality of thought, word, and deed that we put forth. The love of God and the great order of this universe in which we live is a constant. And it's our choice, moment by moment, whether we are going to be aligned with and attuned with that force, or whether we are going to create a negative direction that sooner or later must be turned around. We can be open to an intervention of grace at any one of a number of places in our experience. We can allow grace to transform us in that moment before we make a mistake. We can allow grace to transform us even after we have made a mistake. And we can allow grace to transform us even when we are experiencing the unpleasant consequences of past mistakes. As one Edgar Cayce reading put it, for the law of love, the law of mercy, the law of grace is that no soul should perish, but that all should know the face of their Maker. As we work with aligning our thoughts and our words and our deeds with that great flow, as we open up to the love and we enter into an intimate personal relationship with our Creator, we are given the opportunity to indeed know the face of the Maker, to come into the fullness of our destiny as companions and co-creators with God. In so doing, we discover that indeed karma and grace are one. And as we live our lives each day with that awareness, we are truly using karma in the wisest sense and choosing grace moment by moment. Thank you.